The Dirty Game wasn't just one of the most ambitious spy films of the 1960s, it was a four-country co-production that assembled the man who invented James Bond, a committed Italian neo-realist, a French comedy legend playing against every expectation his audience had of him, and a pre-famed Klaus Kinski in a supporting role, all working simultaneously on three different continents to produce a film that Hollywood then butchered so completely for its American release, that the version most audiences ever saw bore almost no resemblance to what its directors had actually made. So let's take a look behind the scenes of the movie with 20 things you didn't know about The Dirty Game, including the unscripted on-set ambush that left one of France's most beloved comic actors visibly shaking on camera, the entire segment that American distributors cut without a single frame of explanation, and the forgotten fourth story that most viewers have never seen and that almost no English language copy has ever included. Now, The Dirty Game was constructed as a portmanteau spy film, a format that was genuinely ambitious in 1965 and considerably more complex to execute than it appears from the outside. Robert Ryan, cast as American General Bruce, narrates three separate Cold War intelligence operations, each produced by a different national film industry and helmed by a different director. The Italian segment was directed by Carlo Lizzani, one of the founding architects of Italian neo-realism. The French segment was directed by Christian-Jaque, one of the most commercially successful French filmmakers of the post-war era. And the Berlin segment was directed by Terence Young, the man who had personally built the visual and tonal language of the James Bond franchise from the ground up. This was not a studio assembling an anthology for convenience. It was a genuine pan-European creative partnership financed across four countries simultaneously, with production companies from West Germany, France, Italy, and the United States each holding a stake in the result. But the real problem wasn't finding the directors. It was assembling a coherent screenplay out of a creative process, fragmented across four national film industries operating with different languages, different production cultures, and different ideas about what a spy film should say. The writing credits reflect this fragmentation honestly. No fewer than 5 writers are credited: Joe Eisinger, Jacques Remy, Jacques Cabori, Ennio De Concini, and Philippe Bouvard, spanning American, French, and Italian cinema traditions. Eisinger brought a noir pedigree. De Concini was a prominent Italian screenwriter working extensively in genre traditions that Lizzani was simultaneously trying to move beyond. The presence of Philippe Bouvard, better known in France as a radio personality than a working screenwriter, suggests at least a portion of the French material was handled as a commission rather than a true collaboration. The challenge these writers faced was constructing 3 espionage plots that would cohere when threaded together by Ryan's narration, while also functioning as standalone national productions intelligible to audiences in Italy, France, West Germany, and America independently. It was an almost impossible brief, and the degree to which the film manages it at all is more impressive than contemporary critics were prepared to acknowledge. So, the most immediately striking name attached to The Dirty Game, for anyone paying attention to the espionage landscape of 1965, was Terence Young. Young had directed Dr. No in 1962, From Russia with Love in 1963, and Thunderball in 1965. He had not merely been the first Bond director, he had defined what a Bond film looked and felt like before anyone had established a template. He had personally shaped Sean Connery's screen persona, teaching the actor, by widely reported accounts, how to move, dress, and inhabit a space in a way that conveyed effortless masculine authority. His presence on The Dirty Game was therefore freighted with specific irony. He was directing an anti-Bond spy anthology, a film whose entire philosophical premise was that real espionage was unglamorous, morally compromised, and frequently fatal. In the same year he was finishing Thunderball. The two productions overlapped. Young was simultaneously constructing the most operatically spectacular entry in the Bond series and working on a film designed to demonstrate that the world of spies was nothing like it. He described The Dirty Game as a compliment to Bond rather than a critique, which is either a diplomat's answer or a genuinely sophisticated artistic position, depending on how generously you read it. However, the director whose presence represents the film's deepest intellectual tension is Carlo Lizzani, a man whose entire artistic biography stood in fundamental opposition to the commercial espionage genre he was working within. Lizzani had been one of the writers of Bitter Rice in 1949, a film that helped establish Italian neorealism as a global cinematic force. He had collaborated with Roberto Rossellini and written scripts for Alberto Lattuada. His own directorial work had been explicitly political. Chronicle of Poor Lovers competed for the Palme d'Or at Cannes and was recognized internationally as a serious engagement with fascism, class struggle, and collective memory. He was a filmmaker whose career had been built on the premise that cinema had a moral obligation to depict reality rather than construct fantasy. This is exactly why his participation in the Dirty Games Italian segment is more complicated than it appears. Lizzani brought to his segment, which follows an Italian NATO officer caught between competing intelligence services while a rocket scientist's allegiances are manipulated, a visual austerity that sat uncomfortably alongside the thriller mechanics the production required. The espionage in Lizzani's segment is not exciting. It is bureaucratic, murky, and inconclusive. Men are manipulated by institutions that do not acknowledge their humanity. This was not an accident. It was Lizzani inserting his actual beliefs about power into a commercial genre film, using the format as a vehicle for the social commentary his previous work had pursued through entirely different means. Now, what the cameras didn't show was the full extent of the creative risk involved in casting Bourvil as the central figure of the French segment. André Bourvil was, in 1965, one of the most beloved comic performers in France, a man who had spent 2 decades building a persona anchored entirely in gentle, self-deprecating comedy. His collaborations with Louis de Funès had produced box office records. His face was culturally synonymous with harmless warmth. Casting him as Lalande, a serious French intelligence operative sent to Djibouti to prevent Soviet agents from sabotaging American Polaris submarines, was a gamble that his audience's affection would carry a register his established persona had never attempted. What Bourvil did confounded almost everyone. He stripped away every comic inflection and played Lalande as a quiet, internally conflicted professional, a man more like a chartered accountant than a secret agent, and precisely more interesting for that reason. The French segment argued, through his performance, that the men who actually engaged in Cold War intelligence were not suave adventurers, but unremarkable individuals doing a deeply unpleasant job with methodical, unheroic dedication. French audiences were disoriented. They had paid to see Bourvil. They saw a stranger instead. But what the cameras didn't show was that one of the most genuinely surprising moments in the French segment was not in the script at all, and the actor at its center had no warning it was coming. During filming of a scene in which Lalande enters a hotel room, Christian-Jaque and Annie Girardot had agreed, without informing Bourvil, that Girardot would be in the bed completely naked when he opened the door. This was not in the screenplay. When Bourvil walked through the door and saw Girardot, he was visibly, acutely embarrassed, not as a character performing a reaction, but as a man who had genuinely been ambushed. The cameraman, equally caught off guard, failed to call cut. The footage that resulted was spontaneous in a way that no scripted performance could have replicated. The scene was eventually reshot, but the unscripted take circulated among the crew and became one of the production's most talked about off-screen moments, a window into how Christian-Jaque worked, willing to manufacture authentic emotional reactions through deception when the scene required genuine surprise. So, Henry Fonda's appearance in the Berlin segment, playing Dmitry Kulov, a deep-cover American agent who has spent 17 years living under a Soviet identity, requires context about where Fonda was in 1965 and why a project of this type made sense for him. By the mid-1960s, Fonda was operating in a complicated professional landscape. He was 59 years old, and the roles available to him domestically were increasingly military figures and elder statesmen, respectable but rarely demanding. European co-productions offered something different: international casts, unfamiliar genre contexts, and the occasional opportunity to play against the grain of his American image. Kulov, a man who has lived inside a fabricated identity for nearly 2 decades, whose constructed self has almost completely buried the truth beneath it, was a role that exploited precisely what Fonda did best: the suggestion of enormous internal pressure contained within an almost motionless exterior. He could hold more psychological weight in a single sustained expression than most actors could convey through explicit performance. The Berlin segment understood this and built around it rather than against it. However, the character who holds the dirty game together structurally, and whose presence was arguably the most commercially motivated decision in the production, was General Bruce, played by Robert Ryan. Ryan, in 1965, was one of the most respected character actors in American cinema and one of the least celebrated. His career had produced extraordinary work: Crossfire, The Setup, Odds Against Tomorrow, that critics acknowledged but that had never translated into popular recognition commensurate with his talent. In The Dirty Game, his function was both structural and philosophical. He provided the American name the project needed for international marketing, and he provided the moral through line, the world-weary general, who understands that the intelligence apparatus is a machine that consumes human beings and produces, at best, Temporary tactical advantages that change nothing fundamental about the geopolitical stalemate they are all trapped within. Ryan's narration is not decorative. It is the film's argument, delivered by a man who has spent his career making that argument with his life and arrived at the end of it with very little to show for the cost. Now, buried in the supporting cast is a name that in 1965 meant almost nothing to international audiences and would within a decade become synonymous with one of the most volatile careers in European cinema, Klaus Kinski. His role in the film is small. He appears as a Russian agent in the Berlin segment, a presence more atmospheric than substantial. In 1965, he was not yet the figure who would terrify and mesmerize audiences in Werner Herzog's Aguirre, The Wrath of God in 1972. He was a working actor appearing in an extraordinary number of German and Italian genre productions, with a reputation in European film circles for intensity bordering on the unmanageable, whose career had not yet found the director capable of channeling that intensity into something lasting. He appeared in Dr. Zhivago and for a few dollars more in the same year as The Dirty Game, a remarkable concentration of significant titles that reflects less curatorial achievement than sheer volume of output. His brief appearance here is historically interesting precisely because it captures him at the exact moment before his career's defining collaboration began. But the real problem wasn't coordinating the directors or the cast. It was the sheer logistical scale of a production shooting simultaneously on 3 continents with different crews, different national production cultures, and different physical conditions, all attempting to produce material that would eventually cohere into a single film. The Italian segment used the infrastructure of the Roman studio system and the location shooting tradition that neorealism had established. The French segment required the most exotic logistics. Christian-Jaque shot in what was then French Somaliland, a genuinely remote location in the Horn of Africa, chosen because the story required underwater sequences and coastal African terrain that could not be convincingly recreated anywhere in Europe. Moving a film crew to Djibouti in 1965 was formidable, and the underwater photography impressed contemporary audiences in ways the passage of 60 years has made harder to appreciate. The Berlin segment was shot in West Germany, where the proximity to the actual divided city gave the sequences a documentary weight no studio set could have replicated. The wall had been standing for 4 years. The checkpoints were real. The geography of division that the script described was physically present in the streets surrounding the production. So, the French segment's underwater sequences, Lalande diving to locate a hidden Soviet submarine installation, were among the more technically ambitious underwater photography sequences in European cinema at the time of production. The irony that Terence Young was simultaneously producing the most elaborate underwater action sequences in the Bond franchise and working on a film whose comparable sequences were deliberately stripped of glamour was not lost on anyone around him. Thunderball would make the underwater sequence a Bond staple, choreographed, spectacular, balletic. The Dirty Game's equivalent footage is procedural rather than spectacular, concerned with the mechanics of locating an installation rather than the choreography of combat. Young described the 2 approaches as different answers to the same question: what do you do with a camera underwater? Bond's answer was spectacle. The Dirty Game's answer was unease. However, what most English-language audiences have never seen is an entire 4th segment, the West German story, excised from the American release with no explanation and almost no acknowledgement that it had ever existed. The original film, as released in France as Guerre Secrète and in West Germany as Spione unter sich, contained 4 separate stories rather than 3. The 4th segment depicted a former Wehrmacht officer working as a post-war spy sent into East Germany to extract vital intelligence while confronting both his wartime past and the institutional brutality of the Cold War present. When the film was acquired for American distribution in 1966, this entire segment was removed. The American cut ran under 90 minutes. The West German material was gone, and the remaining 3 segments were rearranged. This wasn't an artistic choice. It was a desperate mutilation by distributors who apparently calculated that American audiences would not engage with a protagonist whose wartime past was morally complex. The result was a film that made considerably less narrative sense than what the directors had constructed, and that presented the anthology's philosophical argument that Cold War espionage was morally equivalent on both sides, in a form too truncated to make that case coherently. Now, the film's identity crisis extended beyond what distributors cut from it. It operated under at least 5 different titles across its national releases, and the instability of those titles reflected a deeper uncertainty about what kind of film this was and who it was for. In France, it was Guerre Secrète. In West Germany, it was Spione unter sich, roughly translatable as Spies Among Themselves, which more accurately captured the film's argument about the moral equivalence of opposing intelligence services. In Italy, it was La Guerra Segreta. In America, it was released as both The Dirty Game and, in some markets, The Secret Agents, a title borrowed from a different film entirely, creating genuine confusion for audiences trying to track what they were seeing. The multiplicity of titles indexed a film genuinely differently conceived for different audiences, packaged as a distinct cultural product in each of its home territories, with no stable identity as a unified work in the way most major films of the era possessed. But the real problem wasn't the title or the distribution, it was the fundamental tension between Christian-Jaque's directorial sensibility and the expectations the espionage genre placed on his material. Born Christian Maudet in Paris in 1904, Christian-Jaque was among the most commercially successful French filmmakers of the post-war decades, known for swashbuckling historical adventures and genre films of considerable technical accomplishment. He was not associated with stripped-down realism. He was a craftsman of the polished surface, a filmmaker who believed in formal control as the instrument of emotional effect. The French segment reflects this. It is the most visually accomplished of the three, the most formally controlled, the one that feels most like a complete film rather than an extended episode. Contemporary critics noted its visual resemblance to Godard's Alphaville, a comparison that accurately identifies the segment's debt to the French New Wave's approach to the thriller as a philosophical genre, rather than a purely entertainment-driven one. So, one of the most under-examined elements of the production is the score. Composed by Gian Piero Reverberi, Reverberi faced a challenge that very few film composers have navigated: producing a unified musical identity for a film made simultaneously in 3 countries by 3 directors, with 3 completely different aesthetic sensibilities. The main theme, melancholy and propulsive in equal measure, is a piece of music designed to function as a neutral container holding Italian neorealism, French formalism, and British spy thriller aesthetics simultaneously, without privileging any of them. That Reverberi achieved this, even imperfectly, is a compositional accomplishment that has gone largely unrecognized. The score suggests simultaneously the surface glamour of international espionage and its fundamental futility, which is, as it happens, precisely the argument the film itself is making. However, one of the film's most curious structural decisions, receiving almost no critical attention, is the fact that Vittorio Gassman appears in the Italian segment under 2 different names playing what are implicitly 2 different characters, credited as both Perego and Ferrari, with almost no explanation offered. Gassman in 1965 was at the height of his international recognition. His comedy work in films like The Easy Life and Big Deal on Madonna Street had established him as one of the great screen presences of Italian cinema, and his ability to move between comedy and serious dramatic work with genuine facility made him uniquely valuable for a production needing performers capable of sustaining moral ambiguity without melodrama. His role in the Italian segment carries the quality of watchful intelligence that characterized his best work. A man who understands exactly what is happening to him and to the people around him, processing that understanding in real time without the luxury of being able to act on it. Now, The Dirty Game arrived at the precise moment when the Eurospy genre, the wave of European espionage films produced in the Bond franchise's wake, was at its most commercially vigorous and its most philosophically confused. The Bond films had established a template that was, by design, impossible to take seriously as a depiction of actual intelligence work. They were fantasies of masculine competence in a world where danger was stylized and the moral stakes were comprehensible because the villains were unambiguously villainous. The Eurospy films that proliferated between 1963 and 1969 responded to this in 2 ways, either imitating it with diminishing returns, or subverting it by insisting that real espionage was nothing like what Bond depicted. The Dirty Game belongs firmly in the second category, which is part of what makes Terence Young's participation so pointed. The man who built the Bond template was simultaneously dismantling it one production over. So, when The Dirty Game was released across its various national markets in 1965 and 1966, the critical response reflected the film's fundamental ambiguity about what it was trying to be. In France, the reception was relatively warm. Critics recognized Christian-Jaque's formal accomplishment, appreciated Bourville's counterintuitive casting, and positioned the film as a serious contribution to the espionage film as social document. In America, the response was considerably cooler. The truncated version that distributors had assembled was criticized as incoherent, a verdict that landed accurately on the distributors' decisions rather than the filmmakers' intentions. One American critic described it as 3 mediocre spy films pretending to be one good one, a judgment that applied reasonably to the American cut and not at all to the version European audiences had actually seen. The film was not a commercial success in any market, but it occupied the space many serious anthology films inhabit, between critical validation and popular indifference. But the algorithm of history has treated the dirty game with quiet, belated generosity, and nowadays it is viewed by the devoted audience that has managed to find it as one of the more intelligent spy films of its decade, a work that understood earlier than almost anything else in the genre, that the Cold War was not an adventure but a condition, and that the human cost of that condition was measured not in spectacular deaths but in the accumulated, unremarkable erosion of the people asked to sustain it. The film's principal obstacle to wider recognition has never been its quality, it has always been its availability. No complete subtitled English language version of the full 4-segment film has received an official commercial release. The American cut most English language audiences access is not the film, it is a remnant. A fan-assembled reconstruction, combining audio from the shortened English dub with subtitles for foreign language dialogue and restoring the original segment order from an Italian DVD release, exists in informal circulation, a labor of preservation driven purely by the conviction that the film deserved better than what its distributors gave it. The Dirty Game deserves rediscovery not as a Bond footnote, but as a film that believed, with considerable sophistication, that the proper response to the glamorization of espionage was not parody but the quiet, devastating insistence on showing what the work actually cost. But let me know below, does The Dirty Game's decision to depict espionage as unglamorous, morally corrosive, and fundamentally futile make it the most honest spy film of its era? Or does the anthology format prevent it from generating the sustained emotional investment a single narrative film could have achieved? And given that the version most English language audiences have seen is a distributor's mutilation rather than the director's film, is it even possible to form a fair critical judgment about it?